And that's why I'm so excited about our conversation today about how costs are measured, because there are some really impactful insights that you helped me arrive at that I think we should share, and that totally blew my mind.
Welcome to the Next Gen Metal Fab podcast. I'm your host, Tim Heston. In each episode, my co-host, Oshcut's Caleb Chamberlain, and I will bring you conversations about what the future could look like for precision sheet metal and tube fabrication.
Don't miss your chance to see the latest in metal fabrication solutions at the Fabricators Technology Summit, August 20th and 21st in the Chicagoland area. This exclusive event, hosted by FMA, offers opportunities to visit local shops, see the latest equipment in action, and network with others in the industry. Visit fmamfg.org for more information. And now, back to the episode.
How you doing, Caleb?
I'm doing great. How are you, Tim?
Oh, just great. The last few episodes, we've been chatting about software, its impact on metal fab. Caleb has made some incredible insights into how software can really change metal fabrication's world in the coming years. He's talked about jargon that me, being a metal fab geek for the past 20 years, I have not heard anybody talk about software stacks like he does. I'm used to talking about perf width and nesting and bend deductions, and here I am now talking about software stacks. So that's, But
I will say, if I can jump in, Tim, I listened to that last podcast just the other day, and I was going off in the podcast, a mile off path, and then you keep drawing us back into sheet metal. Okay, Caleb, how does this actually apply to manufacturing?
That's right. And by the time you listen to this, you may be listening to a condensed version. But there's a lot to say about software. And software has a lot of implications about how we track costs in business. But Caleb, just wanted to get the background about how. Again, you started Oshcut, kind of what we call a web shop where people can upload a 3D model and get an instant price, and then click to submit an order. How have you been dealing with costs since you launched the business in 2018?
Well, I wish I could say that we had some amazing, brilliant end-to-end solution that was revolutionary, but actually it's kind of the opposite. What we've really done is we built quoting models first based on what we expected parts to cost to make. And then we've kind of updated those as we've went based on a qualitative feel for how things are going. So if we find a job that takes twice as long as we thought, then we try to build a classifier on the quoting front end that just increases the cost or the price so that we don't lose our shirts on that kind of a job. And that's about it. So I'm not a CPA, I'm not an accountant. I've learned a lot about accounting over the last 2 or 3 decades of my career. But I wish I could say we're doing something sophisticated. For the most part, we're looking at the books at the end of the month and looking globally at our margins. But what's relevant is we are in the process of changing that. And that's why I'm so excited about our conversation today about how costs are measured. Because there are some really impactful insights that you helped me arrive at that I think we should share about how overhead should be accounted for or not. And that totally blew my mind, because we were gearing up to sprint in totally the wrong direction until I learned some of this stuff. So,
talk about that. Talk about, I had actually reached out to Joyce Warnicott years ago when I wrote some articles on quick response manufacturing from Rajan Suri out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was an interesting read because during that time I was getting caught up on theory of constraints and lean accounting and all these different accounting methods that kind of had a Band-Aid fix to try to connect high mix manufacturing with traditional GAAP accounting that that values inventory as an asset, which can lead to all sorts of shenanigans, including the hockey stick effect that we've come across in this industry, where at the end of the month, an OEM will actually order more material. This for the job shop perspective. He's dealing with an OEM. They will order more parts or raw material, wherever you are in the supply chain, at the end of the month, just to produce more for finished goods so they can spread out the absorption and make the books look better. Even though, because again, inventory is an asset just sitting there, but it's not sold and it could become outdated. And they're not sure what to make exactly because it's a high product mix environment. And they're going by cost accounting that was kind of launched out of the industrial age of of the Model T. We're going to make, any color you want, as long as it's black. So
well, let's back up and talk about that a little bit. I had never thought I would get so excited about accounting, but I just love this subject. So we're talking about accounting methods that were pioneered in the early industrial age and spearheaded by GM, and was rivaled as this big, massive revolution and genius way to account for things. And it became coded into law under GAAP. And so businesses have to report that way, but it's actually flat out a bad way to do it. And what blew my mind when talking about it, so if you think about it, it makes a kind of sense, because when we produce something in our factory, we've got a whole bunch of costs that really contribute to the cost of making a part, right? We've got the lease on our building. We've got the air conditioning in the office. We've got maybe the cost to mow the lawn outside. It's a cost of doing business, and indirectly, it's a cost of making that part. So somebody who's a real expert in this could provide a lot more detail, but basically the gist is, under standard costing, is you take all those overheads and you say, well, we're going to produce this many parts, so we're going to build an allocation model. And so if we make 10,000 parts a month or 10,000 cars or whatever, we're going to take all our overheads and we're going to spread them out amongst all the things that we're making. And then when we sell the product, we actually know what it costs us to make it, including the overheads. And when it's described like that, it makes total sense, right? Because I'm not going to build a car or whatever without a factory, and that's a real cost. And I'm not going to build a part without a manager that's overseeing production. It's not direct labor, but it should end up in cost of goods sold, right? Because it actually takes that to produce it. So all these systems are built out to say, hey, you've got to measure this, you've got to roll your overheads in, you've got to recognize your overheads when you sell the product. Under GAAP, you don't recognize the expense until you've provided the service. So voila, it sounds all great. But the problem is that what I've just described is a process in which I take the cost of mowing the lawn and call it an asset. I take it off the P&L. It's not an expense anymore. And for as long as it takes me to sell the parts that I made that month, mowing the lawn is an asset now. What? So you take all these values and you're rolling them onto the balance sheet as a current asset, which looks dang good. Mowing the lawn, it's an asset. Everything else, it's an asset. And then when you sell it, you recognize the cost. So it basically creates this incentive where it doesn't matter if you have high overheads, because it's going to come an asset, and then the P&L is going to look amazing. But what the P&L doesn't show is that I'm hemorrhaging cash and I'm not going to meet payroll next month.
Right.
And
right.
You can't. Wild. Yeah.
Dick Callage, our longtime consultant who used to write for us years and years ago, he's passed away, but he had a great title to a presentation. You can't make payroll with inventory. And where it's just and he used to call it cash in, cash out. The cash in, cash out cycle, where you say, all right, if a job shop usually keeps a lot of inventory because you got to have various materials on hand. So that's cash out. All right. When's the cash in? That's going to, and then the old method of sticking a piece of paper on a blank or a piece of raw stock and putting a date on it, and then keeping that piece of paper with the traveler or whatever all the way to when it ships. And then, all right, that's that. And then do that various times, and then you can get a real inventory turn, so to speak. But then, of course, the turns are great. But what if you're like with now, in your case, it's a little different because your collections are automated. But then if you have far out collections, you have stellar customers who just give you huge orders so you can utilize your equipment. And yet, as we saw in the financial crisis, And other times, some job shops were used as banks, basically, and says, "Oh, we're not going to pay you, but what are you going to do? I mean, we've got all this work that keeps your people employed, but we're not going to pay you." What? It doesn't make any sense. When web shops started appearing, one thing that I thought that was fascinating is now, when I uploaded a part, okay, price for custom work is now public. Before that, price for custom work was not. You could go to a catalog and see a price for an off-the-shelf item, but if it was something custom, it was between you and your supplier, and you got 3 or 4 quotes or however many, and it was not published. You couldn't go online and go, okay, there it is. And you couldn't, I used to write about people who would get manuals of machinery just to, get some parts. Like, all right, let's see what parts are part of this machine. It's like, all right, well, I could supply that part. Okay. And let's see and that's how they would get this information. There was no internet, so they couldn't, and so, but it was all archaic, and they would just kind of throw a price out there to see if they could land the work. And then even if they didn't have a handle on cost because they never made the job before, well, they quote unquote make it up on volume because the cost would go, and it does go down on volume, but they would never make, the margin would never be there. And then on the other side of that, margins, I mean, you've seen our financial ratio survey, margins are varied with customers tremendously. They can, it depends on the sector, because different sectors are willing to pay different amounts. You've got certain sectors where, like, heck, certain sectors, they want to see your books for a certain amount of work. They have open book supply chains. Like, okay, we're not going to let you make enough.
Not only sector, but also type of work. So I just listened to the Brunner fabrication podcast or interview, and I was struck by how different their business is from ours, because we like the 1s and 2s, and they won't even take the 500s, right?
Right.
They want to do just massive jobs so that they can just print those blanks on their 24 kilowatt laser and get them out. So their margins have got to be super slim, but they're cranking crazy volume in a skeleton shop, almost a shed of a shop. And I say that, respectfully. Yeah. And that model works really well, but that wouldn't work for us, right?
Right. So, well, and but again, cash makes payroll. Margins technically don't make payroll. So you can have incredible margins, but if no revenue's coming in, yeah, I'm making 40% margin, but I can't make payroll because there's not enough cash coming in the door. You need cash coming in the door. That's kind of the motivator. As another source of mine in the Chicago area has said, this is metal fabrication is a cash flow business. So I don't care. I mean, margins, you need to know your margins, but you need to keep that cash flowing. Otherwise, that's what can kill your business, because it's a high CapEx is high. There's a high barrier to entry, so you can starve real quick if you don't have the cash, particularly if you're building it with, now it depends. I mean, there's all sorts of businesses out there, as you can see in the financial ratio survey. This is a very liquid industry. So a lot, I've, talked to folks who pay cash for $1 million machines, et cetera. So it's, it's a highly variable business as far as how people leverage out, but it changes. But it kind of describe, the issue, and this is where Joyce Warnicott's book, it really shows, like, it just lit for me, like, yeah, the value of time. There's no
monetary value of time. Why traditional accountings makes your customers wait or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That and it's highly recommended, because it shows you, in your cost model, it does not, what the typical cost model in fab. I mean, various shops do it, but I'll detail the ones I have up here. This is from previous articles in the Fabricator, to be honest. But, it varies. But it's, you take your overhead. Some people split out their fixed overhead and variable overhead for labor rates. You get their shop rates. They say, all right, here's the profit I'd like. Then they add material cost and any outside processing they do, and that they come up with their sell price. That's just one way that shops can do it. Shops do it various ways. And in all that equation, if you have a pile of whips sitting somewhere and you partially produce something and it sits for 4 months, and you have to move that sucker around to get, this sheet, something is, you have to use labor to manage that inventory. That's nowhere in the product cost.
All right, so we've got work booked 2 weeks out usually because we're an on-demand shop, and bigger jobs go further out. Smaller jobs can be as fast as same day, right? So we don't always know what's going to happen, but at any given time, we might have 10 or 15 different jobs on one piece of material. So there's a bunch of wins we could have conceivably by combining all those jobs at once when we can to get better nesting efficiency and save on material costs, and then wait to do the downstream operations until later. So there's this trade-off between cutting a bunch of stuff early and cutting stuff just in time. And the trade-off is in material cost versus space efficiency and so on. But we were getting really excited about this possibility of just deliberately oversizing laser capacity and always just optimizing for laser efficiency, always. And then we realized, we'll produce so much WIP that we don't need right now that we need a place to put it. So we said, okay, we'll have this central, like a storage area, and we'll have automation in there. And we started putting it together, doing the design. It's kind of fun, like from an engineering perspective. We were imagining our inventory storage like long-term memory on a computer versus cache on the CPU. And then I read The Rebirth of American Industry. It actually says, not this exactly, but it's like talking about manufacturing resource planning. And it says, you're spending millions of dollars and building insane software systems to manage waste. Literally. Producing stuff early and then sitting on it is actually waste. Now, it's a trade-off in waste, but it made me realize that maybe that was the wrong play. Maybe what we need to do is go to the opposite extreme and be so lean and quick on our feet that we don't have to spend a whole bunch of money trying to manage WIP. We just like cut what we need when we need it, and then we deal with managing remainders like we already do. So that's not really related to cost accounting, but it is really...
Well, I mean, but there's a cost to it because shop managers have told me, it's like, all right, well, basically we cut this job for, free material because we made it from a drop. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. That could be, and they say that because the material that they saved on material on the other job, and they absorbed the cost basically of the material into another job. But that's just accounting. I mean, that's just moving numbers from one job to another. It still costs you. One, two, you have that remnant sitting there that you got to manage, and so losing the remnant idea and trying to figure out where the hell it is. Or if you cut something and then realize that remnant's got scratches on it and you can't use the parts anyway, and you just ran the laser on a bad piece of material because the operator, didn't inspect it properly or whatever. There's all these different variables of remnants. And so we've had these folks who've really, so they say, all right, I'm going to cut an entire sheet. It's like, I'm not going to do remnants. I'm going to get rid of that. I got to cut an entire sheet. There's too much cost associated with that, but then they overproduce. And so when they overproduce, where are the parts? So there's always costs of handling those parts. So years ago, I visited a shop in Japan that does, this was actually back in the CO2 laser cutting days, and I saw the skeletons that they had. And there were the huge gaps. And material utilization was ridiculously poor. And I'm going, wow, why did you spread that across the entire sheet? And they said, well, we are a quick response. They had 2-day response time for most jobs. It's a different business model in that area because it was so, again, like in Europe, the geography is different. They drip feed 10 parts to the shop down the street. But it was a whole different philosophy, and it was a very small shop. And again, it goes back to there was a lean accounting seminar I went to, and he had all the small startup job shops raise their hand, and then he had the OEM, the guys from the larger OEMs raise their hand, and the small job shops. He said, all right, guys, I need you to teach the folks at the OEM how to manage cash, because you guys, it's he called it posted accounting, but it's logical accounting. It's what you grow up with. You're ignorant about accounting standards, but you know that you need cash to pay people, and so you try to get that job out the door and hustle and get it out as quickly as possible. And that's the essence of it. It's that simple.
So, in fact, the book recommends that shops actually use cash accounting or as close as possible. And then when they file taxes, because you're required under law to use accrual accounting, you make adjustments so it's correct. But in the meantime, you're actually using something very close to cash accounting. Now, we don't do that, but our quote to cash cycle is like a week to 2 weeks max. So like changing how we account is not going to change our strategy that much. But
how is adding an outside processor change that? Because you have a partnership with the powder coater, right? So, or are you guys linked in a way that the costing is not too difficult?
Usually only takes like 4 days max. Usually we have powder parts back from them within 1 or 2 days. So yeah, it doesn't really change the economics of it very much as far as time is concerned.
Then there's all sorts of other possibilities, getting folks out of the weeds and saying, all right, here's a variable that's as long as we float above, tracking all this may be somewhat wasteful. What do you think?
Yeah, well, Joyce recommends that so first of all, suggest that it's a misnomer to say that it's correct that there are fixed and variable parts of cost in the way that we usually do it. Like we say direct labor is a variable cost and it shifts up and down with cost of goods sold, but how many manufacturing companies do you know that actually can turn up and turn down their workforce in a way that doesn't damage the company? I mean, skilled labor is so critical. Everybody's worried about getting skilled labor. And if you treat skilled labor like a fixed cost, and the minute the economy goes down, you fire half your workforce. That's not great. I mean, if you can avoid it, you shouldn't do that. So she actually recommends that you don't even treat direct labor as a variable cost. That instead you only look at material, things that are actually direct and actually vary. So like for us, it would be the cost of steel and maybe the nitrogen gas that we buy to produce parts and say the electricity. All right. Direct costs that truly scale with production volume. And then you're left with a number. You got revenue minus those material costs. And then you have your like true, as close to cash as possible contribution margin. And then you look at that and you say, if I make 100 of these parts, my contribution margin is going to be $100 a piece. And that goes towards your fixed cost, which would include direct labor and which would include all your other overheads.
Another shop I visited years ago, and this has to do, they had implemented quick response manufacturing, which is, basically it's oversimplified. It's just lead time reduction. Though there's more to it than that, which, so much of lean manufacturing is about, different continuous improvement methods are aimed toward that goal. But they had bought a wonderfully automated folding machine, and so they loaded that sucker up with anything that possibly could work. So they even had other brakes with sheet flow followers. So it wasn't even an ergonomics issue. It was that this folding machine was so fast. They said, all right, well, that folding machine, we estimate that folding machine's, the cost of producing it through there is just so low. Let's send everything through the folding machine. But then their lead times were extending out because the folding machine was taking everything. The brakes were just sitting idle, even though they were older brakes, and they did require more expensive labor to run them because they had to know what they were doing. So, but they were tying cost directly to that part as not tying cost to the value of time. And saying, all right, but, so they changed it and said, listen, wait a minute. Now what we're going to do is just load up the folder with optimal jobs, but spread out the routing so that, all right, depending on capacity, we're going to maximize the routings here. It may take longer to bend, but we're shipping faster. Even though these brakes are not being, quote unquote, utilized as much as they could, jobs are flowing faster because of the mix of work we have. And so they changed that, and thereby, the cost of the job that was quoted, quote unquote, was higher, but that's only because if you tie specific assets to specific, so let's imagine they were trying to prove get an ROI for that folder, right? Well, if that folder allowed them to land certain work that utilized other equipment more, but utilized the folder some, but they would never have landed the work in the first place, and then their revenue increased a certain amount, the utilization of that machine doesn't matter because that machine helped land the work because they couldn't do you can fold things that you can't possibly do on a brake because they're too big. And so the utilization is low, but the revenue is rising because opportunities are presenting themselves. So it's not about machine utilization. It's about opportunities arising from a technology investment. And so it's a global analysis. So as long as more jobs and more revenue is coming in the door, you're ahead. You just have to tie that with the technology somehow. And
Yeah. What I really like about that story is that if you look at a normal cost accounting approach where you're actually measuring labor time and you're tying that labor to the work in process, which
Right.
eventually flows into finished goods, you run the numbers on all of that, and that machine is going to look really, really good because maybe it takes less labor and takes less time to produce. But the books, like that accounting method, completely obscures the fact that trying to push everything to that machine is actually hurting your overall throughput and your overall cash conversion cycle, which is a big deal. The idea that it's actually to look at that machine in isolation and to presume that if somebody's not working on that machine, that they didn't actually cost, they become overhead or whatever. I mean, it's just there's way too many ways to structure things so that the numbers don't actually reflect reality, especially in a quick turn shop.
Right. And I'll relay a recent story too, where I recently talked to a company about a recent machine investment, and I'll keep it anonymous. This will not be in the. This was just a fact-finding mission for me, as far as just on background, because we were talking about this throughput aspect to it, and the potential. You go into this. This is an OEM, and it's a high mix OEM, and the potential of throughput in this OEM, if you had certain levels of automation. So if you had automated racks, automated towers going to a robot takes it to a conveyor that takes it to a brake that shoves it out the door, or shoves it to the next operation, I should say. It flows to the next operation. Shoves, wrong word. But anyway, the cost, the upfront cost of that was just too high. That was the issue. It's like we couldn't recoup that. That was the calculation. And so now what they have is automation on the front end. So we have, and you see this everywhere, lasers producing these huge towers, producing all this WIP, and then they have 30 to 60 days worth of inventory for downstream to produce on demand. And they deliver to customers within 48 hours, and it's great. But I'm wondering, okay, but could you have 30 days of raw stock inventory instead, that you could actually produce anything? So you wouldn't have the risk of, because it's a high mix operation. So they have people dedicated to analyzing inventory levels. So you have to pay those people. So that that's not so it costs to maintain that Kanban system that they're trying. And what if you had that in raw stock instead, 30 days of raw stock, so you could respond? Or you could even, do a consignment to the service center, so you could even be even leaner, depending on how, your relationship. There's all sorts of potential there if you ignore the typical costing.
So you told that story about this meeting, and all the small fabricators raise their hands, and all the big contract OEMs raise their hands. It strikes me that this whole distinction between, like lean accounting versus standard gap accounting and whatever, it starts to apply when you hit a big enough scale that you actually have a team of accountants keeping track of stuff. So there's a good chance that for all the listeners who are smaller shops or privately owned shops, and smaller being you could do tens of millions and still be a small shop. You're probably already doing the accounting right, by virtue of not being a giant, monolithic corporation that has to do, quarterly closures and all kinds of stuff and reporting. At the end of the day, from a practical perspective, we're sitting here trying to figure out how to find out at a per job level what it costs to make a part, right? So there's the time involved, there's the material, there's scrap rates and everything else. And we want to understand where our margin drain is so that we can fix it and improve our margins just by bidding the right amount for the right work, which is a noteworthy goal, I think. And we're doing that. We're working on it. But we're actually completely ignoring overheads in all of that calculus.
Right.
And we're not ignoring overheads when we bid, because when you bid, you have to understand, hey, if I was at 100% utilization or 80% or 50%, and I was charging based on this contribution margin, ignoring overheads, would I cover my overheads? how small can I get before I'm not covering my overheads anymore? And so that's kind of the question you have to ask. So you do have to account for it when you quote, but when we cost, completely ignored. And we're just looking at the direct stuff, and we do include labor as well. And the impact is that we just understand that when we're bidding based on contribution margin instead of bidding based on, gross margin, then we have to look at it a little bit differently. Like our contribution margin has to be a little higher to cover the overheads compared to what our gross margin would need to be to win the job, right? Right. So that's kind of where we've landed, where we're saying, yeah, we're not going to go crazy on overhead allocation models, which frankly is kind of a relief, because I didn't want to hire an accounting team to babysit our overhead allocation models, absorption models. It just sounds like a nightmare. So we kind of sidestepped that altogether by
it is
kind of ignoring it. Yeah.
Just ignore it. Yeah.
Not really.
Well, but as long as it's flowing through, like, because your remnant management, I think, is a huge thing with that, where you have nailed that, and you realize that, if we are going to get it, because that's a hidden cost that folks don't, because it has to keep flowing. And if you can't manage your remnants well, while just producing, then your material yield calculus goes out the window, because then, all right, yeah, we nested common line, and we just have this little itty bitty left, and this is great. And we even did skeleton destruct on the laser, so you don't have to deal with certain aspects. So the cost of disposal's down. Where the hell is the remnant? You can't find it. But you have a barcode system? Is that what it is?
Yeah, our system, it's really cool. Everybody hated doing remnant tracking, and filling out labels manually and measuring stuff with a tape measure. We'd end up with giant piles of remnants on tables that just sat there. So finally, we wrote a system that looks at the nest, figures out what the remnants are and their size, and then you punch a button and it automatically does the inventory, prints a label, you slap it on the sheet, and then you scan the label, scan where you're putting it, put it on the shelf, and then our system says, hey, for this job, a week later, here's the sheet, here's where it is, go get it, put it on the deck, and that will often produce a remnant too. So we'll do like 3 to 4 or 5 generations of remnants that we can trace all the way back to the original PO line item that we bought it on.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, and that's, and I have a feeling that job shop that I visited years ago that had huge, horrible material yields, if they had that system, they wouldn't have been doing it.
We don't have any automation for loading. We have bridge cranes and suction lifters.
Right.
Forklifts. And the reason we can't use automation is because we very rarely use a full sheet. We use it once, and now we've got a whole family, 5 or 6 generations of remnants we've got to use, which means we've got remnant shelves, and a worker walks up and grabs the remnant and sets it on the deck, which is great, but we wouldn't be competitive if we had to do that for, super high volume work.
Right. And then that's where the challenge, there's a shop I visited in Europe with a huge tower system that actually handled remnants, which is very interesting. And it was a complex system, but it worked. And again, it was one of those huge systems where it was like this, man, that better be a really reliable engine for that Boeing jet, that kind of thing, where it's like, because if that goes away, it's, then getting into that and getting the remnant and actually shoving it through the so it's interesting. But yeah, just to wrap this up, this has been a great conversation. This recent reading you did, how has that changed your trajectory about how you're going to develop your system and kind of, think about costs moving forward?
So we're eliminating overhead absorption models altogether in our accounting. Aside for whatever period end stuff we have to do to remain compliant, but we're not going to be worrying about overhead absorption. We will worry about overheads because they're expenses, not assets. But we're not going to roll those overheads into parts. Meanwhile, it'll say these parts are more profitable than they would look if we were tying overheads into WIP and finished goods inventory. So they will look more profitable from the perspective of contribution margin, but we'll understand that we've got a lot more expenses that work we do have to eat into and pay for.
Right.
So we might say we're going to target 30% gross margin, with overhead allocation, but that means that you need like a 60% contribution margin or something like that, right?
Right.
Because you've sucked all those overheads and just throw them on the P&L where they belong instead of putting them on the balance sheet. So that's where we're headed. We don't have all of the measurement yet, though we did roll it out in bending because that's our big bottleneck. So all our operators are like punching that time and we're understanding what it actually costs us to make those parts, and that's good.
All right. Well, and then of course a disclaimer time, and all the, especially for me, and Caleb's actually producing parts and running a company. Everything I said is secondhand and told to me, and just with shop owners and managers riffing. Of course, it just doesn't have the gravitas of real experience. So don't go out and buy a folder and be happy that it's just sitting there.
Yeah, definitely. Do your homework and don't treat what we said today as gospel necessary.
Right. Yeah, but it is what makes this industry interesting, because you got all sorts of folks who it's again long-tailed, largely small businesses who always question the status quo, which keeps my job interesting, because the more people I talk with, the more new thinking I hear out there. And we're just getting started. So, Caleb, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tim.
The Next Gen Metal Fab podcast is a production of Fabricators and Manufacturers Association and part of the FMA Podcast Network. The show is hosted by Tim Heston and Caleb Chamberlain. The podcast is produced and edited by Garrett Slager and Dana Weicker. Additional production support by Dan Davis, Andy Flando, Mike Owens, Billy Culpa, Elizabeth Gavin, and me, Sarah Spring. Thank you for listening.
And that's about it.